So thanks for having me. I think I would have responded to that poll sort of somewhere in between because I saw half the film, not because I didn't enjoy it, but it was about 3 a.m. and I'm going to watch the second half. I saw enough to know that it's very much like the world I saw when I went to Israel, and I can make some connections. I will, obviously, any of you who've seen the film, you can feed in questions as I'm speaking, and I'm happy to open it up to a conversation at the end. But a little backstory, Udi contacted me to talk about organized crime in Israel. And I had no idea I was going to write about organized crime in Israel. I was actually writing a book, which you nicely showed. It's called Barney Ross, The Life of a Jewish Fighter. And Barney Ross was a fighter in the 20s. Many of you may know there actually were, not just like Joe Matzabal Levine. There were about 3,000 professional Jewish fighters, as there were many Jewish gangsters in the 1920s and 30s. I was fascinated by this world. So I was living in Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan on 35th Street, and I wanted to learn how to throw a left hook. I felt like that's the secret of boxing lay in it, if I could understand the science of it. And a gym had opened up on 34th Street and 9th Avenue. I walked in there, and there was a tough Israeli guy, about 30 years old, named Ilan Ben Shoshan. And he is a really great friend. He became my guide to Israel. And there's Ilan. Ilan is in the foreground throwing a really serious kick. In Israel, it's called Igruv Thailandi, Thai boxing. And the other fella is my other guide, Eli Weitzman. They were both champion Thai boxers. I'll explain how this connects to the organized crime world in a minute, but so I come into this gym. This actually was taken in Tel Aviv when we went to do the article. And I'm trying to learn to throw a left hook, and Ilan is talking to me, and he's always on Israeli news websites. And he says, "Wait, a journalist, this is about 2002. He said, "Why aren't you writing about all the assassinations going on in Israel?" And I said, "Well, first of all, I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, the organized crime. Don't you know that everybody's like blowing each other up, and there's all these murders, and it's crazy over there right now?" I said, "Stop, explain this to me." So he started to tell me about organized crime in Israel. Now, Ilan, if you guys have seen the film, these two no-goodniks, they are collectors at the beginning of the film. They later are doing some wish fulfillment at the Kotel, at the Holy Wall, the Western Wall. But at the beginning, they're sort of collecting from restaurants. Ilan, when he first came to New York, was collecting. I won't be specific about what, but that's part of organized crime, going to get the money. If you see that kick right there, I asked him once, well, why did Thai boxing become so popular with organized crime in Israel? Because, Yiddish Kop, typically if you see the mafia, a guy goes to collect, he's got a baseball bat or a tire iron. That kick is like a baseball bat hitting you. So the Israelis figured out very quickly that if you learn to Thai box, you don't need to carry a weapon. The police can't stop you. That kick will shatter a guy's knee if he doesn't pay up. So he was in that business that you saw in the film of those guys going around and collecting. So he says to me, "Why don't you write about organized crime in Israel?" I pitched it to GQ magazine, and they were fascinated. And I said, "Well, you got to send me to Israel. I can't write it by myself." And by the way, my Hebrew is not very good. I had basic bar mitzvah level Hebrew. And there's a lot of slang, which they used in this film, by the way. So Ilan has to come to Israel with me as my guide. So there we go. GQ finances. We're staying in the David Intercontinental Hotel in Tel Aviv. And immediately, the first thing I see when I go to Israel is not, what you expect, the beaches. I go to this loan shark's office. Literally in this, if you go to the next slide, this neighborhood called the Quarter of Hope, Shuchnat HaTikva. It's literally on the next slide. Yeah, that's Rehov Etzel, which is Etzel Street. It's in South Tel Aviv. If any of you have been to Israel, it's actually close to Yaffo. South of Tel Aviv, it's considered the ghetto, and it's the Jewish ghetto. It's the Mizrahi. I grew up Ashkenazi, as probably most of you did, and I thought everybody who wasn't Ashkenazi were Sephardi. Well, those of you who've been to Israel know not everybody's Sephardic because they didn't go to Spain. Mostly this community is Moroccan, Iraqi, like Ilan's family were Moroccan and Yemenite Jews. The other fella, Eli Weitzman, his family were Moroccan. This neighborhood is extremely tough. It is kind of considered the ground zero of organized crime in Israel. And the minute I got there, I saw stuff that I didn't know would exist in Israel. They don't tell you about it at the Israeli tourist brochures. I saw loan sharks. The first place I went was like a loan sharking office. The second thing I heard about was all these gambling dens. prostitution, collecting. There's a thriving organized crime underworld in Israel, as that film demonstrated. Those guys are absolutely cut from the cloth of the world I went to. They are Mizrahi, those guys in the film. It's Steve and what was the other? I can't remember the second guy's name, Udi. But anyway, the Chuma. Sorry, Chuma and Steve are absolutely, we'll get to this sort of stereotype of our scene. They were tough, vulgar. I saw that same explosiveness that you see in the scene where they bash a guy with the chef with the chair, just explosive like that. That's the world. That's what you see when you get to Hatikva. And one of the things that was going on when I got to Israel, there was a massive power struggle involving most of the families in Israel. You'll hear these names. They are Mizrahi, largely from Morocco and Algeria, other North African countries. Although the boss of this neighborhood, before I got there, he was assassinated in 1993. His name was Yeheskel Aslan, and he was from Iraq. And everybody who remembered him, he had a deformed face because he'd been shot in the face a few times. He was the original boss of Hatikva, and Ilan, my guide, actually grew up in the main street. His mother was a madam. She ran a brothel, and he kind of grew up in this, to me, extremely foreign world of Jewish crime and poverty. And what I was searching for in my research for this book about Barney Ross, who had worked for Al Capone and the lost world of Jewish poverty and crime in America, I found it here in Israel. And Yeheskel Aslan, so the original boss that everybody remembered, he was assassinated, next slide, by a man named Zev Rosenstein, and he became the top boss. He was things became much more violent in the 2000s because Udi and I were chatting about this. In the early days, there was always organized crime in Israel, but it was very territorial, and they would be fighting over, so maybe gambling, turf, loan sharking stuff, and it was really
write the one word next to each one, and then we sang it.
Oh, hold on, I'm hearing a sort of.
Yeah, hang on. Let me just want to.
Okay.
If you folks can mute yourselves, I'll.
Everybody on mute? Okay, thank you. Sorry. So Zev Rosenstein was the new power figure when I got there so it's about 2003. And he'd survived a bunch of assassination attempts. The reason he got much more violent, they were no longer fighting over the loan sharking and the gambling and the stuff that, there's a famous line credited to Benjamin Siegel, Bugsy Siegel, saying, "We only kill each other." Well, as long as kind of organized crime groups are just fighting amongst each other, it doesn't really affect too many people. Rosenstein rose to power because ecstasy, those of you, I know my demographic here is probably not a partying crowd, but that became the big drug in the 90s and 2000s, club partying. And another little known fact, Israelis kind of invented it. At least they dominated it. And law enforcement in the US said that 84%, I believe, around 85% of the ecstasy in the world was controlled by Israeli organized crime. Rosenstein was one of those bosses. Wow. And he'd survived multiple assassination attempts. One of the biggest things that happened, go to the next slide, is the 10th of December, 2003, right in the middle of Yehuda Halevi Street in Tel Aviv, there was a noonday explosion. First thought everybody thought, of course, was this is terrorism. Meaning it is terrorism. It's just, it wasn't Arabic terrorism, Islamic terrorism. It was Jewish on Jewish terrorism. Rosenstein had a money exchange, a currency exchange, and they were trying to catch him there, his rivals, and they blew it up. And 3 innocent people were killed. So this is when it started to become part of the, this is when Ilan said to me, we got to go there and investigate this stuff because it's really becoming a dominant part of the Israeli culture. It's kind of affecting innocent people. And I got there and I was fascinated by it. And we're going to go to, I think the next thing is they're going to go to a poll question. Right. The man I showed you, Zev Rosenstein, he had survived 7 assassination attempts. He's still alive. So I don't have to read it to you, I guess. Can you guys guess his nickname? All mob guys have a nickname, right? So you have Bugsy Siegel and you have Lucky Luciano. What was the nickname of Zev Rosenstein?
All right, we got 21 out of 34. 24 out of 34. Some people
Cat,
still
Cat,
considering it.
Ganef, Wolf, or Boychik. It will help if you know maybe both Yiddish and Hebrew. By the way, the Mizrahi community does not speak Yiddish. They're very big on they speak Hebrew, and they're very big on Arabic slang. There's a bit of cursing in that movie. I won't say the words, but they use these Arabic curse words, and that's exactly what I heard at Tel Aviv. Okay, well, you know what? It looks like a tie, but the correct answer is wolf, because Zev in Hebrew means wolf. The wolf with 7 lives. It was a pun on his name. He was sometimes called Zevik. Good guess, though, everybody. I'm glad nobody gets Boychik. That would have been silly. So now we're getting into the stereotypes. Those of you of a certain age will certainly know, this is New Jersey, right? So the Jersey Shore. The Jersey Shore character, you'd call them sort of a Guido. And in Mexican-American culture, those guys with the bandanas, they call it a cholo. There's always a kind of negative stereotype, the loud guy with the gold chains. So in Israel, everybody knows this word if you're a young person in Israel, and even now older people. It's ars, and the plural is arsim. It actually comes from the Arabic word for a pimp. It doesn't mean a pimp in Israel. It means a very loud, flashy, tacky, usually that's a different picture, but open neck shirt with lots of chest hair showing, really they love to wear a hamsa, the hand of God, upside down, and the gold chain, really loud and aggressive. I found a YouTube video which I shared with Udis. It was a kind of poll question. What do you think of Arsim? So if those of you who have been to Israel know, it's in the Israeli culture and character to be extremely, let's say, self-possessed. You could say aggressive as well, right? The driving, the way they play soccer, everything is aggressive. Well, the ars is the ultimate of that. These guys from this culture you would call them arsim. They're not sophisticated people. They're pushy and loud. And I would say that Steve was kind of an ars character. They can be charming too. Some people in the YouTube video I watched said, I love arsim. They stand up for themselves. So that's the thing I noticed, by the way, in the Mizrahi culture. I'd hang out with these guys, and if I wanted to insult them, I would say, "You're an arse." I'm not an arse. Like that's, it's really it's insulting, and it doesn't really apply to Ashkenazi people. There may be a few, but it's in the. And by the way, we have to be a little bit honest here. For many, many generations, the Mizrahi community were treated kind of as second-class citizens. They were seen by Ashkenazi Jews. It's sort of like, here's a joke, or it's not a joke, it's an actual thing that happened. I was hanging out with all these Mizrahi guys. I was at a house party, and one of the guys says to Ilan, I'm the only Ashkenazi guy there. He said, oh, he's not like the other ones in Hebrew. And I said, what does he mean? Well, you're not like the ones in North Tel Aviv, the Ashkenazi guys who would not hang out with them. And I thought about it. What he meant was, I'm sure those of you who have family in Israel, like my family in Israel, they're university educated, they're, Tel Aviv is not much different from Manhattan or any nice suburb of New Jersey. But the Mizrahi guys I was hanging out were so tough. Most of them had worked as mechanics or bicycle couriers or various jobs, and none of them had been to university. So they found there wasn't a lot of socializing between the Mizrahi community and the Ashkenaz community. So, I wanted to get that across before we really delve into like the organized crime community being Mizrahi. There's a kind of reason they came out of poverty and they came out of this tough environment where they felt they were being discriminated against. Ilan told me once when he was in the army, he started to date an Ashkenazi girl, and he came back to meet her grandmother on the kibbutz, and she said, "You're dating a Schwarze." And now Ilan is totally Jewish. His grandfather, great-grandfather, they were all Moroccan rabbis. He came from a very long line of rabbis. And remind me, Steve, if I don't say Udi, I've got to tell the story about the Western Wall and the prayer with Ilan. But let's go to the next slide. This is, I guess you would call these guys Arsim. Yitzhak, so the sworn rivals, all these clans are fighting with each other. These are the Abergil family. Yitzhak was the boss. One thing that's different from the Sopranos, you see where, the older mafioso or 50s, 60s, you could be a boss in Israeli organized crime at 25, 30. It's a very young culture in general. So this is the boss. Yitzhak Abergil was Israeli kingpin, ecstasy kingpin. He had labs in Belgium and Holland with his brother, who's also, we're going to get to it in the next slide, but they were famous. They were a big case where Yitzhak and Meyer Abergil were extradited to the United States Yeah, Meyer was the financial kingpin. They were brought to the U.S. facing cases in California and were convicted. Israel doesn't like to extradite normally. It's a big issue because of the law of return. And I'm just checking the date. In 2011, they were extradited to the U.S. They faced a huge indictment. I think Yitzhak is serving 10 years. Meyer is back in Israel, but he's got 3 years to do. They were extradited to the U.S. basically for running the biggest ecstasy ring in the United States and involved in some murders. A fascinating thing about ecstasy, I found, those of you who know a little bit about diamonds, we all know the diamond district in Manhattan, but the biggest diamond quarter in the world is Antwerp.
Doug, you froze up on us.
I did. I froze?
Yeah, maybe just on us.
Was it just on us? Did anybody else?
I still see myself.
It might be our connection. Go ahead.
I'm drinking water. Can everybody see me drinking water?
Yes, we see you drinking.
Okay.
Carry on.
So anyway, everybody knows the Diamond District in Manhattan. There's a huge diamond. The biggest diamond district in the world is actually the Diamond Quarter in Antwerp. And there's the connection to Amsterdam. So the labs for the ecstasy generally were in Holland and Belgium. And the route was Israeli financing. The ecstasy was made in Holland and Belgium, and the smugglers would come over to New York. Lots of times they were yeshiva bochers with the long, payas, carrying little briefcases, because normally you have a lot of diamonds in the briefcase. They would have ecstasy. These guys, the Average Joe brothers, were either using Orthodox yeshiva-looking boys or strippers. So in any event, it's a bit comical. They finally were facing justice and were extradited. Now, a bunch of the clans, they literally are families. Abergil, Abutbul, we'll get to the next guy's name, Alperon. It rhymes with Al Capone. Alperon family, they literally are a family. There were like 5 or 6 brothers. This is Yaakov. He was the patriarch of the family. He was considered, according to the FBI, he's an ex-boxer. I think they called him the last of the old Sicilian-style Israeli mafia bosses. And that's what it's like, by the way. It's much, much more like the Mediterranean crime we associate with Sicily. Those of you who know about Naples, there's the Camorra. In Corsica, there's the French connection. Well, Israel has its own crime, and these guys, these North African Jewish families, they tended to be clans, super violent. They would use bombs. One thing that's very interesting I found about this world is it's really easy to get hitmen, because the entire population of Israel, who's male, from 18 to 21 has done time in the military. If you come from a poor Mizrahi family and you were in the special forces and you come out, and the economy was very bad when I was there, hence the visits to loan sharks. The guys told me it's very easy to get a guy in the special forces who's broke, and the boss, Yaakov Alperon, gives him $1,000 US. Boom, 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 he drives up on a motorcycle. And the scariest thing, these guys have weapons training. They've already killed. They said the scariest sight in Tel Aviv is like a guy on a quick, like Honda motor scooter with his helmet down. It's really like the Mexicans call it sicario. The hitman who comes up on the motorcycle and zooms away. That was a big thing. So anyway, Yaakov Alperon was very well known as the head of a big clan. And I think the funny joke we're going to tell is that the Israeli TV, they kind of embraced this mob culture. This is a famous model. Her name is Yael Goldman. She was on an Israeli reality show. It was called Once in a Lifetime, where they paired this beautiful, Ashkenazi model with a Mizrahi clan leader, Yaakov Alperon. And I think the quote is, I'll read it. You see The Sopranos and it sounds sexy that some mafioso comes and charms you into the sunset, but in reality, it is the opposite. It's very intimidating. It's scary. It's not kosher. And that was her experience. I mean, I think for most Israelis, let's go to the next slide. This is what happened to Yaakov Alperon. Sorry. There you go. November 17th. So this is after he was on the TV show. On November 17th, 2008, there was a huge explosion in Tel Aviv, Namir Boulevard in the north of Tel Aviv. He was only 53, and his white Volkswagen was blown to bits. The assassin was seen to have been ordered by a guy named Amir Molnar. The details aren't that important, but it's indicative of just how cutthroat and bloody these turf wars were. Of course, when bombs go off in Israel, the first thought is fundamentalist Islamic terror, it's Palestinian terror. And that, I just have to make one point about the religious nature of this Mizrahi community. You saw in that film, in our comedy, how actually observant. They're quoting, your name came from, this is my parsha from my bar mitzvah. And you think, well, would criminals actually be this way? 100%. The most orthodox guys I ever met in Israel were these same criminal groups. And they come from very, very, first of all, sort of politically right-wing to very anti-Arab. I saw a lot of graffiti in Hatikva that said death, Malshaneh means death to the snitches, but also death to the Arabs. They're very, very ultra-right, and they are also really religious. So at this funeral of Yaakov Alperon, his son, I know this sounds a little gruesome, but it's true. He screamed, "I will catch who did this. I will cut off his hands. I will cut off his feet and his legs so he will not be able to get a proper Jewish funeral." And that's exactly, that's the kind of thinking. They are extremely violent, they're criminals, and yet they believe in the Torah, letter for letter. And I experienced Shabbat in Hatikva with my other guide, Eli Weitzman, and it was the most observant. The entire neighborhood just shut down for Shabbat. Literally nobody was driving or walking. So it is a curious phenomenon that you can be both a criminal and extremely devout and actually knowledgeable about the Torah. So
this might be the time for you, Doug, to mention your trip to the Wailing Wall with them.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. So, long story short, this ended up running in Tablet magazine because GQ got cold feet because of Israeli politics and some issues with war in Lebanon. But we had a great photographer with us who was a Czech guy. He didn't trust any of the labs in Tel Aviv, and every day after he shot our images, he had to drive to Jerusalem. So I have an aunt in Jerusalem, and I wanted to go, and we drove up there. And Ilan said, "Well, let's go to the Kotel, the Western Wall," which figures absolutely prominently in this film. And I didn't know the tradition of writing you see it with yellow paper, you write your prayer, you put it in the wall, and supposedly it goes straight to Hashem, it goes to heaven. So I said to Ilan, "Well, you're descended from all these Moroccan rabbis, help me write a prayer in Hebrew." It was something personal, it had to do with my daughter and my personal life. And to be honest with you, it has been answered. It actually worked. But I had him write it, and he said, "Okay, well, the best way to do this, then you say it." And I put on a tallis, and I did that. So when I saw the footage of, those of you who saw, I won't give it too many spoilers because I didn't really get to the end. But the idea was actually very clever, because you wonder, where do all these prayers go at the end of the day? They must bury them, take them out. But the Steve guy pulls up this thing because the other guy's ear is bleeding. He writes down a note, he puts it in his pocket. And of course, because they have survived this bombing and they think it was, Hashem, God has spared us. The other one says, we've got to go around doing good deeds. And let's answer this poor Shmendrik who, works 17 hours a day and they have to go solve these wishes. So I actually did that with Ilan, and I found it very true to life. There were many, many things in this film that I had personally experienced, which rang very true. So when bombs go off in Israel, traditionally everybody thought, "Oh my God, it's terrorism." So in this period when I was there were a lot of bombings, and they were the result of organized crime. So you wonder, well, why was it happening? Why was the Israeli police force caught unawares? You can go to the next slide. Of course, Israel's police force, from the founding of the state in 1947 until I'm there, 2002, 2003, their main focus is the security of the Israeli population. The security from when terrorism erupted. I can very well remember the PLO and Arafat in the 70s. I remember Entebbe. At that point, when Israel started to face internal terror, that's what the police, they had their hands full. And as long as the crime was sort of in these little Mizrahi neighborhoods against each other, beating each other up over apple carts and stuff like that, watermelons, Udi and I were joking about, it was small time. But when bombs are going off in the middle of a busy street, there was another horrible murder she was just a random person who was killed at the beach. She was a social worker, and the public kind of had enough. Well, the problem for the Israeli police was, there were a number of problems. One is they had geared their entire apparatus to fighting terrorism rather than violent crime from within. And the second is, those of you who've been to Israel, it's an amazingly small place. 6 million people? It's tiny. Is New Jersey probably bigger in terms of the landmass? Probably. I think it's a very small place. And when you think about if you were going to testify against a Genovese crime family member in Alpine, New Jersey, or in there's absolutely, somebody guessed it, there's absolutely no witness protection, doesn't exist there. There is no, what happens in American organized crime cases, of course, if you cooperate with the FBI, they can relocate you from the New York area to Arizona or Utah, as many people have been done, and you're very unlikely to run into the guys from the old neighborhood. You can't really do that in Israel. It's very difficult. So it was very hard to find witnesses. Now, when I wrote my articles, there had just been a criminal unit called 433 that had been geared towards helping fight organized crime. But it's an uphill battle simply because the country's small. People are afraid of testifying against these guys. And, I would imagine most of you watching this film probably didn't know that much about there being organized crime in Israel. It's not something that really hits the newspapers, and so it's a relatively localized problem. It's a big enough problem, though, that the Israeli police had to crack down and create a special unit. Time for our next fun pop quiz. There's lots of open secrets. Like when my mom was a kid in Chicago, there were bookmaking places. She was there, the guy across the street, it was supposed to be a liquor store, but it was a bookie. I'm sure in Newark, it was the same in Jewish neighborhoods everywhere. That place, it's really a front for this. So in Israel, there were lots of these everywhere. And you'd see the sign and I would say, well, Ilan, what is that? And he would say, it's a gambling spot. You can go in there and make illegal bets. Bet on whatever, bet on the soccer games, whatever it was people wanted to bet on, completely illegal. But so the question for you is, are they check cashing places? Are they tanning salons? Or are they internet cafes? If you see the sign in Hebrew, there are legitimate ones. But if you see it, neon in Hebrew saying this following words, those in the know can just go in and lay a wager on Maccabi, football team, soccer bets. Israelis love to gamble, I saw. Probably like most cultures, but I'm curious how many of you are going to guess this. It was news to me. I would never have known. So. Okay. And the majority of you guessed correctly, internet cafe. If you saw the word internet, there are legitimate places where you can go in there and, but at the time I was there and there's an image of it, you'd see this thing and it was sort of an open secret. Everybody seemed to know, you go in there, you lay a bet. I guess the police lay off it simply because it's, who's it hurting? Or maybe, I don't want to speculate, but, most times these things are open secrets. Somebody's getting paid off to let it go. The other thing was there were brothels, and the word there was health club, and I would say, well, there's a health club, let's go work out. No, that's actually a Russian brothel. Or these kind of open secrets. There were legitimate gyms, but if you saw certain words in Hebrew, it was a code, at least in Tel Aviv. I don't know about all the cities of Israel. Interesting thing. And I think, by the way, for those of you who think, I was a little concerned writing this article thinking, am I getting I saw it in your flyer, in your online flyer, Shanda for the Goyim, are we making Jews look bad to other Jews? Well, at the end of the day, to me, what the comedy showed me, as well as my own experiences, well, Israel's a country like every other country. You go to France, you have the Eiffel Tower, but you also have heroin addicts, and Israel is a democracy. It is a small country, but it has incredible Nobel laureates, and they're some of the best pharmaceutical development, but yes, there's organized crime and there's junkies, there's everything that any other fully formed society would have. Why would it not? It's a country like any other. So this character, Nissim Alperon, this is now the boss after his older brother, Yaakov. I think there were 5 siblings, and they were all these really rough, tough looking characters. What did Nissim, his claim to fame was he stepped in as the boss. I think they're at war with the Abergil family. He may have been, forgive me for a second, I made some notes. He is, now he's the reigning boss, at least in that clan. Like I said, it's, you hear the words like Gambino family, Genovese family. Well, there was Vito Genovese and there was Carlo Gambino. Those are just kind of names. In these families, the Alperon family was literally 5 brothers, the Alperons, Abergils. Literally, when they say the family, they mean the family. There are guys working for them, but these Mizrahi families tended to be a lot of siblings, not to stereotype, but and so he literally is now the boss. The next one is I found it really strange. All these guys had names beginning with A, Alperon, Abergil. The next guy was, Asaf Abutbul. This family's Abutbul. So the next is actually a casino in Prague. This started to get international around the time I was writing this. It was 2004. Some guy came in through a beautiful casino in Prague, and the target was a guy named Asaf Abutbul. And somebody came and threw a hand grenade at him. It was big news in Prague. And his father, Felix Abutbul, who was the head of that family, had actually been assassinated by a sniper in 2002. So there's this ongoing turf war had spilled out from Israel. You started to hear about organized crime hits happening in other European capitals. And when I get to the end of this, I'll mention it's actually still going on in other parts of the world. Interesting, I'm actually writing about the Russian mob now. This fella is considered the most powerful mobster in the world by the FBI. Semyon Mogilevich, he's actually when they say the Russian mob, it's a misnomer, right? Because he was born in Kiev. So it was the former Soviet Union. They speak Russian. He's a Jewish mobster. He has an Israeli passport. So I could say this is part of Israeli organized crime. There is a big Russian presence in Israel. As most of you know, when the Soviets began to allow Jews out, 70, 71, through the fall of communism, everybody had to say, I have family in Israel. And they would get out through Vienna, go to Rome, and then they could change their visa application and come, as many did, to Brighton Beach, to other places. But originally you were going to Israel. Well, many did go to Israel. And the one thing I can say about that word ars, I didn't tell you this, Lee, is that of all the things that the Mizrahi families ran, gambling, extortion, murder, the one thing that was considered completely taboo was to be a pimp. It was very low class. So the Russians had no problem with that, and they started to just, it's a whole other conversation, but there's a thriving prostitution issue in Israel of these girls from Belarus and Ukraine, and the Russian mob brings them in. They fly them into Egypt. Their passports are taken away. These girls travel via the Bedouins into places like Tel Aviv, and they become prostitutes, and the Russians completely run that business. So Semyon Mogilevich is extremely powerful mob figure. He's not really based in Israel. I think he travels there, but all the stuff you see in the news about how corrupt is Russia, he's considered one of the FBI's most wanted men, and he's now actually in Moscow living completely free. I mean, he's one of these guys that's like an oligarch worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's probably fair to say he's the most powerful, certainly Jewish mob guy in the world. So our joke question, or is it a joke? Who of you can guess this? The billionaire Russian kingpin. I should have said Ukrainian Israeli, but anyway, former Soviet Israeli mob kingpin Semyon Mogilevich is known for his financial acumen, which he is a very bright guy. He's about 5'6", he's about 300 pounds. So is he known as the Big Knadel? Is he known as Semi the Bull? Is he known as the Brainy Don, or the Boss of Bosses? I will accept. I was never a teacher, but I will accept all guesses at this point. You get points for even having heard of any of these people.
We've got 20 out of 33 voting. All right, going to end the polling. There you go.
Oh my goodness, nobody got it. So two answers. Most people call him the Brainy Don because he is a very, very bright, the Russian mentality in organized crime. But some people also call him the Bosses of Bosses, the Boss of Bosses within Russian organized crime. Okay, I just got a call. So Udi asked me, well, could you bring it up to date? I haven't been, this isn't my beat. I haven't been following this. But a Mexican journalist just contacted me and said, I read your series in Tablet. Can you comment on this world? And I said, what are you talking about? Oh, you didn't hear there was a huge assassination. 2 guys were killed in Mexico City by a hit woman, a Mexican hit woman in a wig. The Elon Azule, I haven't heard of him, but the other guy, Ben Suti, he's actually a very infamous figure in the same world, the Tel Aviv Mizrahi world. He had already done a long prison stint in Israel, and he was over there in Mexico making a big cocaine deal. Doesn't surprise me that, the drug industry in Israel, like every other place, it doesn't surprise me. The Mexican cartels are the most powerful in the world now, so it doesn't surprise me he would be there. But the theory of the case, this Mexican journalist said, is that actually it was an Israeli on Israeli. It had nothing to do with the cartels. One Israeli crime family seems to have hired some Mexican hit people, and they did it in broad daylight in Mexico City. And it was huge news in Mexico. And the thing he told me is that, I don't know how many of you know this, there's quite a big old Jewish community in Mexico City. I actually have some family there, and there's a neighborhood, very affluent neighborhood in Mexico City called Polanca, like the Beverly Hills of Mexico City. Very, very affluent Jews. I don't know how large it is, probably, but I would think tens and tens of thousands. They said this Ben Southi guy shows up from Tel Aviv, and he immediately went to the Jewish community and was shaking people down, like, give me 10,000, pesos, or I'm busting your windows. So he immediately went to work there. And I said, well, it sounds like the Mizrahi guys I knew in Israel. I imagine he's going to go to the Jews and scare them, because I think he threatened them saying, I know some of your family in Israel. Not very savory guys, but those of you who saw the film, they're pretty, these guys were likable enough. The boss, I got far enough along to see the boss completely seem true to me. Someone was honking at him, and he puts his Mercedes in reverse and just runs the guy over. These guys are really tough and ruthless. It made it into a comedic canvas, our film for the day, but it's so based on reality. Nothing was far-fetched that I saw. Now we're actually opening up to questions. Now,
at this point, let's open it up to questions and see, what thoughts or things people want to know. You can either probably just speak up, take yourself off of mute, and just kind of.
Me or I have to stay on it. Off mute.
All right.
If there's no questions, I can also just speak a little bit about the phenomenon of this world. As I said, I got into it through sports. I didn't know that the kickboxing and hear these guys talk about Igruv, Thailand. They actually, both Ilan and Ellie went to Thailand. This is the home of the kickboxing world, of the Thai boxing. And the Thai fighters are very, those of you who know anything about martial arts, it's the hardest kick. It's much harder than a karate kick. Okay, David has a question. I'm sorry, I'm getting that middle age. What was the question? Didn't you put a flash up for a second?
Wait, was there a question in the chat? I didn't see it.
Popped up and said David.
Can you speak to tensions between the Mizrahi mob and the Russian mob? Do they cooperate?
I don't know that there is. I hope I don't go on mute here. Am I on mute?
No, you're fine. We're hearing you, and I'm monitoring the mute. The chat.
I didn't hear of tensions between them. So I'll be perfectly honest. I had to go and see everything, and I remember Ilan. I said, "Well, I've got to see." You're saying this health club is a brothel, and these guys just look like Russian heavies. I mean, not Jewish, because I think you need like maybe one grandparent to qualify to get out of the Soviet Union. Some of these guys just look like they were completely Russian blood. The guy at shaved head is a huge guy, just like you think of a Russian mobster. And we were going to go in and have a look at what was going on in this health club. And he didn't mind Ilan's ID because it had Israeli names. He sees my ID, and I have a New York driver's license. And he says, "New York, you're a cop." And Ilan says, "We know all your friends in Brighton Beach. Now let us the F inside. Come on." So we went in. The prostitution had been given completely over to the Russians. So I didn't see any turf war between that. I think where there's money to be made, the Russian organized crime, which is what I'm writing about actually right now, it's just on a different level. I mean, the Israelis, I'm sure there's some cooperation with the drug business, but the Russian organized crime, at least the early wave that was in Brighton Beach, they went into tax fraud, gasoline tax fraud, all sorts of things targeting the government in the United States. That wasn't really the Israeli turf. And the Russian mob guys I know who went to Israel, it was mostly diamond ripoffs. These guys love diamonds. It's a very portable wealth, I guess. Very easy can steal $1.5 million in stones very quickly. But I didn't know of any. The turf wars I saw really happening were Mizrahi against Mizrahi. And these
we have another question. Are any Palestinians involved?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not up on the names, but the latest sort of update on the top criminal groups. Yes, there are Arab. Now I don't know whether to call them Palestinian because they may be Arab Israeli, right?
Israeli Arab.
But there are Israeli Arab crime groups, absolutely. And it's like anything where money is involved. Like the Bedouins who smuggle these poor Russian girls and Lebanon girls across the desert into Israel. The Bedouins hate the Palestinians. The Bedouins don't work with the Palestinians. So the Bedouins there's organized crime essentially everywhere. I'm assuming every ethnic group has it. But yes, there absolutely are Arab organized crime groups. And I think there's actually probably a lot of cooperation between the Israeli crime groups and the Arabs, more than there would be between civilians, because there's money to be made.
Well, at least there they get along.
Yeah, I actually found that.
Honor among thieves. There you go. Any other questions? If not, let's go to this concluding thought.
I have to say one nice thing. Well, yeah, if there's no other questions about crime, one of the most beautiful experiences I had was just, there was some kind of likability to these two leg breakers in this movie, right? Chuma and Steve. And they were not likable enough guys, right? They have, one's abandons his kid. There's flaws and all this stuff, and they're rough, tough guys. But I found the same thing. I go to Hatikva, and I remember. So Hatikva is the quarter of hope. But the guy I'm with, Eli Weitzman and Ilan, Eli says, "You want to come to my house for the Shabbat?" I said, "Sure." And I remember Ilan saying, "Do you feel the Shabbat coming on?" The Shabbat comes on in Hatikva like nowhere else. So all the women are off shopping. And it literally was, you've heard about this. There's tensions in Israel where in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods, they throw stones at your car if you drive through. Well, no, in Hatikva, everything came to a stop. People were done their shopping, and then it was like Shabbat. It was quiet. So it's a little, I want to call it a hovel. It was like a little stone house. His father was this poor Moroccan guy, Eli Weitzman. And these guys they know every prayer. They don't read from prayer books. They know Hebrew, like everything that has to be said in Shabbat, they're very, very learned. So we had beautiful Shabbat, and the door was wide open because it's warm in Israel. And this little strange boy wanders in. And I think he grabbed a piece of challah or whatever we were eating. And I said, "Well, who's that?" He said, "I don't know. It's just, there was homelessness in the neighborhood, but it was Shabbat. So here comes this little boy, and he had a little, it's Shabbat, you welcome everybody." It was beautiful. So I want to stress that even though there's organized crime in Israel, and it's something that we shouldn't focus on as being a huge part of Israeli culture, even I want to say that Mizrahi community, I found they are famous. You can correct me if I'm wrong. They're famous for hospitality. It's really like super, super, super insulting if somebody comes in your home and you don't offer them food and everything. Much warmer, I found, than they said, like the Ashkenaz from the north. So I want everybody to know that you can actually go, if you want to find the best hummus and falafel, you go to these Mizrahi neighborhoods, you go down by Etzel Street. There are still wonderful things to see. And organized crime is a very small aspect. I'm saying this in a hopefully not too defensive way, but the same way Italians feel about seeing The Sopranos. I can't watch that. A friend of mine is Italian, rough tough guy from East Harlem. He really grew up in that world. He said, "I can't watch that Sopranos. It makes us look like a bunch of gavones. Like, do you ever see me curse in front of my wife and kids like that, Tony Soprano?" So I'm sure a lot of Israelis are embarrassed by the fact that it exists, but let's be honest, it does exist. So in this comedy, they're showing you something real. Everybody jokes about it. There was even a joke of a girl going on a blind date because you're expecting so-and-so and you get a loan shark. It's a part of Israeli culture. And I think I said this, I'll just bears repeating. It's just a sign that Israel is a country like any other, right? And you should visit Israel. You should love Israel. There's nothing. I went to Princeton, and my undergraduate was in New Jersey. Every one of you who's from New Jersey knows it's the Garden State. There's incredible nature in New Jersey. The stereotype of New Jersey is the armpit of the nation, based on what you see right outside of Newark. Yeah, the Turnpike, exactly. But you go to the Pine Barrens, and there is an incredible culture that you get stereotyped with one little aspect. So I wouldn't want this film to be anybody's one snapshot, and I don't mean of Israel, but of Mizrahi society in Israel. It is much more than that. They provided the cuisine that we all, hummus and falafel and the stuff that is considered Israeli cuisine. It sure didn't start in Bialystok, where my grandparents came from. We brought bagels and stuff. The Mizrahi culture brought a lot of amazing, the jewelry was the Yemenite Jews. A lot of what we think of as Israeli style and Israeli cuisine is actually coming from that early wave of Mizrahi people. So I hope that we still have a positive view of Israel, despite the fact that they break some legs and blow each other up sometimes. It's a sign that Israel is a culture and a fully formed society like any other. Huh? And if anybody has any other questions, you're free to email me or ask anything else if it comes up. But
all right. Thank you very
So
much.
that'd be-
This is how you applaud in Zoom. You kind of wave your hands like a little. Okay, there you go.
Well,
Thank you, Douglas Century.
Thanks
Are we
for everybody tuning in.